Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 153, Playing with Shakespeare, a conversation with Charles Moseley. Today's guest episode marks the start of a short run of episodes that will be a little different from the usual pattern of a narrative episode one week and a guest episode the following. I'll be away from the writing desk and the microphone for a few weeks, so I have prepared a series of guest episodes to fill the gap in the narrative. Once I'm back, it will be onwards with the journey through the Shakespeare and Jonson canon, starting with that extraordinary history play, Richard II. I'm very much looking forward to getting stuck into that one. And today's guest episode serves as a great precursor for what is to come. The discussion that you are about to hear with Charles Moseley focuses on Shakespeare as a man of the theatre and discusses how the plays were created for and affected by the theatre, the audience and the conventions of the time. And that brief description does not do this wide-ranging and detailed discussion any sort of justice. I think that all of the thoughts that Charles discusses are well worth holding in mind as we work through the plays of Shakespeare and Jonson over the coming months. Charles Moseley is a difficult man to summarise in a few words. He's a historian, a literary critic and a travel writer, but that only touches on part of his extensive output and experience. Most relevant for our purposes today are his years as college lecturer in English at Magdalen College, Cambridge, then Director of Studies in English and later Fellow of Wolfson College, and finally Senior Tutor and Director of Studies in English at Hughes Hall, Cambridge. The depth of knowledge and enthusiasm that Charles brings to his subject is, I think, quite self-evident, and I'm sure you will enjoy every moment of this just as I did. I spoke to Charles over Zoom from his home in Cambridgeshire.
Playing with Shakespeare, theatre, writing and performance. Now, my first question, there are three main questions I want to look at. What went into what we call a Shakespeare play? Secondly, what do we mean by that term? And thirdly, how does our understanding of the plays as, up to a point, certainly commonly constructed, interact with a very different sort of audience to ourselves? How does that affect our reading of them, in every sense, our reading of them? So let's start, first of all, with the issue of script or text. All plays from Shakespeare's time, 1580s to, say, 1620s, are especially difficult to talk about because we come to them almost always as texts. And they are not texts. Many of them were never printed. We haven't got them, obviously, because they weren't printed. They're not text-like books. They are felt, heard, seen, indeed smelt experiences shared with other people whom you could see, not as in a modern theatre, masked by or isolated in darkness. That makes a huge difference to how you watch and how you receive something. You interact with those watching. You interact with the actors. One of the things that I think we all found very exciting when the new Globe was new, is how you were getting eye contact with actors. And they were doing it with you. And that completely alters the dynamic. They're not like scripts that we might give an actor now even. The author, when we give an actor a script now, the author has decided on the final version of his work. It's a play by X. But there's evidence all over the place that every script was substantially fluid. It was altered often for each performance. Look at how in Hamlet, for example, the player king, the players who are introduced, a delicious joke this, they're introduced to the court by Denmark's Lord Chamberlain, and they are the Lord Chamberlain's players who are actually on tour at that very time.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, and they accept from Hamlet an interpolated speech. Yes. There is no problem about that. And similarly, if you think about 1780s in Vienna, in the operatic culture, Mozart, Salieri, and all the others were writing arias to insert in each other's operas. And it was just absolutely normal. And the thing that we really, really forget is that Shakespeare was fundamentally a man of the theatre. He was not an author in our sense of the term, primarily a writer. The only things that he bothered to see through the press were Venus and Adonis and Lucrece.
Yes.
And there's a very good case for saying that those are job applications Being in the theatre was a pretty precarious business. But if you could get a job as a secretary to a big man, like Southampton, for example, then your financial worries and your security worries might be over. And that fact needs to be re-emphasized in every generation. For the major part of his life, he was not writing books. He would have looked with blank incomprehension at a shelf of the New Cambridge or the Arden Shakespeare, though he might have been pleased, and Jonson would have been envious.
Definitely.
So, how did theatres work? First, what went into the making of a play? Now, Shakespeare's company was a bit unusual in that it was a company of sharers. They all had shares in it, or the main people had shares in it, and they were in it not for art, not for posterity, but for the money. If you didn't have the theatre full of people paying, you didn't have any dinner. They're operating in a very tight commercial world. It's a very small society where pretty well everybody who is everybody knows anybody else who's anybody. There's great rivalry for audiences between the different theatre companies. There's no separation, easy or clear, between the worlds of theatre, law, after all, shared clienteles, shared locales with the Inns of Court, or indeed politics. Theatre is part of the game of power and influence. It manipulates opinion, and occasionally it's dangerous. No wonder the Privy Council kept a very tight rein on what the players could and could not do. They censored everything, every script that came before them had to sign it off and say that's okay. Now, one of the consequences of this sort of community acting is that it's a company of permanent members. You've got, therefore, obviously, fixed casting possibilities. You've got to use what talent you've got. And you had no women. The women were played by apprentices, boys as young as 7, just learning the trade, by definition are not going to be that good. And so certain possibilities are closed off. Serious, mature women, as distinct from comic mature women, like Juliet's nurse or Mistress Page or Mistress Ford or Mistress Odom or Mistress Quitline, those are really going to be rather difficult to write for a boy who's still learning the trade. And it could be argued that the really big parts for serious women, Queen Margaret, Juliet, Constance, and so on, or later, Cleopatra, Volumnia, Goneril, they coincide in date pretty well. And it could be you've got a boy who's coming to the end of his training and is really good, and then his voice breaks. And you have to go back to getting boys into women's clothes and out of the women's clothes as quickly as possible so they can get back into male attire, as, for example, in the comedies around 1600. So we're watching boys, as I say, who are having to cope with these difficulties, and Shakespeare's got to cope with these when he's writing. He's also got in that community, he's got people who are stars. They have a big following. They're big draws. You've got to give something to them that will play to their strength. For example, Edward Allen, with his capacity to deliver those magnificent big lines of Marlowe, the mighty lines, like for that. You've got people like Will Kemp, who can play a certain type of clown. So as long as you've got him in the company, you've got to write that sort of thing. And so an interim conclusion one can draw from this is that he knew what talent he'd got, and he knew who he was writing for before he began to write. And he played to known strengths, he avoided weakness, and this, in some considerable degree, restricts his freedom. The actors, as individuals, obviously could have a good deal of input during the writing and during performance. I mean, you can just imagine somebody looking over his shoulder and saying, well, Bill, I don't like that line. I can't say that. You've got to change that. Yeah. Because they're a very intimate group. But also, we've got lots of evidence that parts were actually ad-lib. For example, the murderers in Richard III. A lot of ad-libbing clearly preserved in the text there. And then think how Hamlet says to the players who arrive at Elsinore, "Let your clowns speak no more than is set down for them." And of course, is just after that real scene stealer, Will Kemp, had left the company.
Right.
Robert Armin had joined them. So there's quite a lot of ad hominem writing, quite a lot of playing games with the audience, if you like, which is actually part and parcel of the fun of the whole thing. Even physical appearance. Around 1600, there's a couple of actors, one who's very small and one who's very tall. Quite clearly, Maria in Twelfth Night is called a giant in Scorn because that's a very short one. Helena in Midsummer Night's Dream is the painted maypole.
Yes.
we know who played that part. It's a man called John Sinclair, who also played Starveling and who also played Cheek in Twelfth Night. Think about Burbage's weight problem. I mean, by the time he's playing Hamlet, he's beginning to get into middle age. And that duel scene at the end, is it he's fat and scant of breath, or he's hot and scant of breath? The reading is entirely possible in both directions. But the really good example of this is the tradition, which is probably reliable. Hamlet and Julius Caesar are very close in date, they're a year apart.
Yeah.
And the actor who's playing Polonius was a man called John Hemming. And he, if you remember, he reminds the audience at Elsinore, when he was at the university, I played Caesar. I was killed in the Capitol. And he says it to Hamlet. Now, the previous year, John Hemming almost certainly played Caesar in Julius Caesar. And Richard Burbage, who's playing Hamlet, almost certainly played Brutus. Now, that's a delicious cross-play joke. Gets even better when we remember that John Hemming was famous for having a stammer. Now, this is important because, after all, Caesar is he's got some very grandiloquent speeches. I am constant as a northern star. Yeah, here's your man of destiny. Well, the ambiguity of attitudes to Caesar won't let you get away quite with that. But if you have a Caesar who's got big ideas but stammers, you've got the human weakness as well. I am constant as the northern star.
Yes, very different.
Think of how that works with Polonius, because here is a man who's been an advisor to two kings in turn. He's not a nobody. He's not a fool. But if he stammers, then you can see why Hamlet will say, "Oh, these tedious old fools." Yeah. So you've got a lovely sort of crossplay joke going on, but it's a sheer gift for the characterization. When you've got an actor who can handle this, that gives you an idea how all four characters were played and how audiences remembered them from one play to the next.
Yes.
So there's a lot of self-reference and a lot of self-conscious meta-theatricality going on. In fact, you could even say that it's almost like actors saying, look at us actors playing this part. The part that is represented is itself a role. It's trapping the player, what we would say the real person represented, in all its ambiguities and values. Almost like a pianist performing a well-known piece of music. We are listening to the performance as well as to the music. Right. And I think that's something we often forget, that the illusion of reality is simply not there. Yeah. We're aware of a performance going on. Going back to this point about visual memory and memory from one play to another, fixed casting possibilities. Well, think of Richard II being played by the same actor who plays Prince Hal and Henry V in that sequence from Richard II to Henry V. Pointed thematic parallel there. It's an irony that no text actually records. It can't do. And then, again, not just within Shakespeare, think of Shakespeare in his context. Jonson wrote The Alchemist for the Blackfriars Theatre in the spring of that year, 1611. Shakespeare wrote The Tempest in the autumn of that year. Both plays have a lot of things in common, and they are so different, not least the 24-hour duration of the represented action. They take place unity. They've all both obey the 3 unities. But Burbage played Subtle in The Alchemist, and months later played Prospero in The Tempest. And what I love is that, I absolutely love this, that the boy who played Miranda a few months earlier played Doll Common.
Ah. Yeah.
Which is absolutely delicious, isn't it? Now, assume that you've got a play script. Assume you've got the people who are going to play it. Then you've got to think how you make that work. First of all, there is no time to write it all out. So, how long does it take you to write out King Lear? Weeks. And how many actors are there? And each have to have a copy, forget it. It's not printed till much later. So we have to have cue scripts, i.e. each actor has literally his role on a roll of paper or a roll of whatever, probably paper, with his lines on it, with a 2-word cue at the beginning and a 2-word cue at the end. And nobody among those actors would have seen the whole script before the first performance. They would have seen the plot, because we know that was put on the nail in the tiring house, so they knew what the action was going to be. But they would not have heard the whole play. And so there's got to be absolute trust between the actors who are taking part in this. Yeah. And you can see this actually happening in Midsummer Night's Dream, when the mechanicals are given their roles and told to go away and con them. And we know with what result. It follows from that. We know, because there were so many plays in the repertoire, that there was virtually no time for rehearsal. So that means that there has got to be a fairly standard blocking. Now, blocking is something a director will spend a lot of time on. You stand here on stage, you stand here on stage. But there isn't time for that. And they don't have directors in our sense of the word anyway. So if you're playing a king, you know how to use the stage and where to stand, which means that all court scenes are going to look quite similar. And if you are aware of the use of the stage, you will realize that the focal point of all sight lines is at the back, underneath the canopy of the heavens. And if somebody like Richard II starts there and moves to the front, that has an enormous symbolic importance. But the irony is that as he does so, he increases his intimacy with us and our sympathy for him. Right. Ditto with Lear. And if it goes the other way, Henry IV, for example, as somebody who is suppliant to the king, a long way away from the point of the centre, as he moves to the position of power, he loses a lot of our sympathy and then gets it back in a different way. So, there's a lovely sort of play about this, and this use of the stage. And this would all be part of an apprentice's training. So, that one major consequence to summarise is the similarity of all court scenes in Richard II, in Lear, in Hamlet, in Julius Caesar, for example. Trial scenes, good example from Henry IV, Part 1. That this isn't. Let's stay with Richard II for a minute. That play is full of trial scenes, and of course the two principals, Henry Bolingbroke and Richard II, alternate between them, and so you've got a beautiful visual illustration of the movement of power and the difference in judgment between them. You could say the same thing about Lear, of course, but there's a lovely example of how this use of the stage can work, and visual puns can work in the first part of Henry IV. Now, the king has been telling his son off in Act 2, Scene 3. In Act 2, Scene 4, we have a parody of that, where Falstaff is sitting, or what is he sitting on? You don't lug a throne on and off stage with every slight change of scene, because it's far too heavy an object and it's far too big. And furthermore, an empty throne on stage is going to be a massive symbol, particularly in a political. Oh, yes. So think of it. Do thou stand for my father. And so we have this extraordinary sort of parodic version of kingship and rule in Howl and Falstaff, having seen the real thing well, which is the real thing? Which is the real thing? Or is, in fact, the Falstaff plot, is that actually a sort of parodic commentary on the sort of mayhem that Henry IV's usurpation has let loose on England and resulting in all these rebellions? Well, you can argue that one, until the cows come home.
Yes.
It's such a fascinating possibility. And of course, the theatre has got its own symbolism. It's a very non-naturalistic sort of setting, isn't it? I mean, when Othello says, "By yon marbled heaven," and he's clearly pointing up to the heavens above the stage.
Yes.
That word marbled is a giveaway. He's not pointing up to the stars, the real stars. He's pointing up to the stars and the zodiac painted on the canopy over the stage.
Absolutely, yes.
And so, again, we're back in a world of artifice rather than naturalism. And if you think that the word theatre, which Burbage adopts for his new playhouse, nobody ever talked about playhouses as theatres before. Where did that word come from? Well, the only context in which you find that Greek word used in early modern culture in France and England before the very late 16th century and after, in fact, 1576, when Burbage's theatre was built, is in anatomy theatres or in books of instruction like the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum of Abraham Ortelius, a great sort of atlas, which is an anatomy of the world. And hang on a minute, if you look at the surviving anatomy theatres of Salamanca and Padua, with a small stage for the dissection and then concentric rings around it, isn't that rather like the sort of theatre that the Berbers uniquely built, as near a circle as you could get? An anatomy of the world, an anatomy of the little world of man, as John Donne puts it. So a very non-naturalistic, very rich sort of context. Then you've got to add in the fact that although there's a non-naturalistic nature of setting and acting, or what have you, there is a lavish realism or vividness, if you prefer, of the props. You have, several in Henslow's diary from the 1590s. He gives an inventory of the props that the admiral's men actually own. And they've got a hellmouth, a word or two on that in a moment. They've got several severed heads. They've got a whole collection of swords and various sort of accoutrements for doing nasty things to people. But that hellmouth is fascinating because what happens if the hellmouth is on stage at the end of Dr. Faustus? It turns Dr. Faustus from a tragedy into a morality play.
Yes.
Think about the symbolism of the empty throne. There it is sitting there. By God, I will ascend the royal throne. Okay, at your own peril, do so. And we know what happened to Henry IV. So it's all absolutely fascinating, all these conventions that we've forgotten. I mean, can we get our heads around the idea of ending King Lear with a jig? But we know that it happened. We know that it happened. Can we get our head around the idea of don't leave an apprentice alone on stage? And doesn't that put an interesting spin on Juliet? That remarkable boy who could handle that part and who draws attention to it by saying, my dismal scene, I needs must play alone.
Yeah.
Wow, they're saying this is taking a risk. And of course, we forget how radical that play is because that's the first time in my knowledge of this period, of any period really, before this, it's the first time that you've got an entirely serious public expression of feminine sexual desire. Right. And that's a major first.
Yeah. In
a play which is radical in its severe criticism of the authority of parents over love. This is the very time when the Anglican Church is saying parents must not ignore the consent of their children. So it fits entirely with that revolutionary time. And, still thinking about apprentices. the convention of certain styles of acting. I mean, there's a book published in 1642 by a man called John Bulwer, which is full of woodcuts. And it says that it is a handbook. The title says it's a handbook of body language, though it doesn't use that word, the language of gesture for orators, preachers, and actors. And so there's a code. If, for example, you do that, sorry, you didn't see that. If you can do that, you are asking for agreement. If you do that, you're telling somebody. And if your arms are like this, you're like Ferdinand entering in the Tempest with his arms in this sad knot, knowing perfectly well that signifies that he's deeply in love.
So that was just three different gestures you did there. One with the right hand raised and the fingers just held together.
Just held together like that.
And that meant?
That meant that you're seeking agreement.
And the second one you showed there was the other hand.
You're telling somebody.
With a flat hand, just...
Yeah.
And then your arms crossed across your chest.
Like so.
Yeah.
It's very in love. I mean, I don't know them all. I'm not members.
But that would have gone to the level of people standing in the audience, knowing what these things meant, and the actors would have been using them as these are. Yeah. We all know what's going on here.
Yeah. I mean, you've still got vestiges of that body language in the way people speak nowadays. I mean, the fact that I use my hands a lot indicates that this is a natural human thing to do, but it can be codified and was codified. It goes back to antiquity, actually. Yeah, lots of those conventions of acting. Michael Hathaway wrote a lot about this, so did Muriel Bradbrook. But there's also something which is weird to us. There was a film in 1944, I think, of Laurence Olivier and Henry V. It was heavily edited.
Yes.
Fit a particular political time. But they're on top of this because Henry V is making a speech and he doesn't speak to the actors. He goes to the front of the stage, speaks to the audience, and then goes and waits for the applause. And very often you'll find it when text gets printed that you'll have a couplet and there'll be brackets around it. And this is what's known as a point. You're making a point and you're expecting people to listen to you and you will take your bow and then you step back into your role. And the interesting thing is that this is absolutely against any of our ideas of naturalism and realism.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely flat counter to it. The world's changed quite properly, and as it always does. But, this is something that we have got to recognize built into the play. It's effectively the star. Look, the easiest thing is to think about opera. A woman who's dying of tuberculosis does not sing for 20 minutes.
No.
But when she does and stops, the audience claps. And it's exactly like that. Yeah. That sort of relationship with the audience. And it's that relationship with the audience which is so interesting. And it works too with soliloquies. I mean, I often think the soliloquies in this period, though they are changing the nature of them is changing over Shakespeare's lifetime. They're very often like arias in opera. They're variations on a theme. When you have said, well, what does the first quarter of Hamlet say? To be or not to be? Aye, there's the rub. Well, that's all you need to say. That's not the whole thing. But look at the number of variations that the other texts of Hamlet have, where effectively it is like an aria, ways in which you can think about this problem differently. Now, to be sure, there are changes happening, some of them driven by drama itself, in the concept of character, and the result in the concept of soliloquy over Shakespeare's lifetime. There's no question about that. But the point still stands that very often we have an audience watching a performer performing. He's taking bows, he's making points, and it destroys any idea of illusion in our sense. And indeed, there is very often an insistence that what we see is not real in several cases. Take, for example, the player king in Hamlet, that wonderful speech, which is not parody. It's a marvelous piece of high rhetoric. The the rugged pillars like the Hyrcanian bear. It's marvellous speech. But then that lovely question about, what's he to Hecuba or she to him? And yet it looks real, but it's not. And yet is it? Anyway, suppose that we've now got the show on the road. What about audience? What about the back chat? Now, it's interesting that every mention of an audience that I know of in Shakespeare is nearly always hostile. They're always interrupting. Think of Theseus in Midsummer Night's Dream. Think of Hamlet while watching the play. And this is almost certainly recording something that actually happened. The audiences did comment and shout, make noises, and generally be objectionable. Again, the idea of people in their good clothes sitting in darkness in expensive seats they paid for, forget it. It's no wonder, the theatres could be very rowdy places. Now, you see what we've done. We've got to the point where we've got communal construction. We've got something which is being constructed according to certain conventions, played according to certain conventions, watched by an audience with completely different expectations to ours. We've destroyed the idea of the author's intention. He's only one of the many makers of a play. He's probably the most important, but he's still not there. Well, it's interesting, as I say, how rarely Shakespeare's name appears on the title page before 1600.
Yes. Yeah.
But this is what happens, as I say, there's this change in the whole culture in those 40 years. And then the author's name begins to appear. And between 1600, say, and 1620, the author's name gets bigger and bigger. For that, it's usually, as it hath been played by so-and-so's servants. And then gradually, you begin to get the author's name in little letters. So it's so easy to forget what a consummate practical man of the theatre Shakespeare was. And, the gimmicks of some not very good modern directors are constantly foundering on the sheer professionalism of Shakespeare's writing. And I remember seeing a production by the RSC, actually, at the Barbican of Macbeth years ago. And there's the English scene, and the news comes of Macduff's children and wife having been slaughtered. And there we have a totally bald Macduff. And all of a sudden we're expected to take seriously the fact that Malcolm says to him, "What, man? Now pull their hat upon their brows." And, it's a cue to the actor as to how to behave. I mean, often in the text itself, you've got cues like hat. I mean, he would have been wearing a hat. Well, pulling it on your brows, that was a sign of grief. It was one of the conventional signs that we taught about on Bullia. And the precision of Shakespeare's notation is absolutely mind-blowing. Boys have a smaller lung capacity than men. The periods of their speaking cannot be the same length. And it's interesting, if you look at the length of the periods in the speeches for the boys in the important serious parts, they're always a good deal shorter than the periods of the speeches for the men.
Right.
He's allowing for that. He understands what the stage can do in its language. I mean, for example, Cleopatra's bed. Now that's got to be, it's a heavy object, it's a big thing. It's got to be on stage for about over 300 lines in her last scene. I mean, Peter Holland made this very clear about 20 odd years ago in a fine article. And that bed is a symbol of her power. It's a reminder, as she robes herself before her death, "Give me my robe, put on my crown. I am again for Kidness, husband I come." It reminds us of the barge at Kidness, described by Enobarbs, which we did not see. No. But suddenly we are seeing what it was that captivated Antony. Before that, we see her as a tomboy. and somebody who would make an appalling ruler. Suddenly the whole thing comes together with that wonderful scene. And it goes even further because she's got to fall backwards. And then you think, hang on, what did she say? Boy, my greatness in the posture of a whore. It's just so multi-layered. It's wonderful. Well, we talked about the throne on stage as a symbol. But there are, as I say, all these little embedded stage directions that, when listened to, they actually say something. They're codes for the actor. You know, honestly, his plays are idiot-proof if you'll only listen to them. Or dolt-proof, as I prefer to say. There's a fine example of this, self-referentiality, and indeed how something should be played, when Mistress Quickly says, as a comment on the little play that's being acted out by Falstaff and Prince Hal, he doth it as like one of these harlotry players as ever I did see. Because it is a harlotry player doing it, it's a style to do it in, and it's a profound pointer to the business of the play. Which is the actor, Henry or Falstaff? You know, we're back at the idea of the king as a player, the player as a king, and that raises some really subversive questions. Because if you have a poor player, strictly speaking, a vagabond, and you know, if not in a company that's got a patron, and therefore technically the servant of that patron, somebody who is a vagrant and therefore subject to the vagrancy laws, if you put him in fine clothes, as we know that they did, and he looks like a king and speaks like a king, is the king no more than a man who's made by his clothes and his speech? That's pretty subversive.
Very, yeah.
And, you know, the plays do raise these issues. But staying with this idea of professionalism, in The Tempest, for example, Ariel has got to come in like a harpy. And then, of course, he's got to go away again and come back as Ariel. 74 lines are given for him to go out and change and come back and then say, you are three men, and sing and what have you. And 74 lines are given for him to go away and get back into being Ariel. That's remarkable. They had no zips. They had no Velcro. This is a quick change, but he knows how long it's going to take. This is really, really good professional writing. And he knew perfectly well that when you doubled a part, plausible disguise was out. You weren't far enough away from the actors for that to work. And so you build an announcement of who it is and who they're playing now. But when you are doubling parts, just think of the gorgeous joke of having the mechanicals play the fairies in Midsummer Night's Dream. Good mustard seed, said to a great hulking man, and bearded as well, you know. And they're called Peas Blossom. And we know that doubling did take place. There's also the understanding that the text has to be heard as well as merely watched. So it's rhetorically articulated for acceptance by the ear. Self-referential, indeed. We need to recognize the reflexiveness of a lot of the scripts, to see the plays as firmly embedded in a now unknowable, or at least a mindset we can't ever experience. We can never know that. And as I say, we've talked about the crowd on stage and the crowd in the theatre being visually indistinguishable. And think of how that would work, for example, in the crowd in Julius Caesar or the crowd in Coriolanus. The dividing line between audience and the crowd, the audience in the yard and the crowd on stage, is very difficult to draw. And they're being psyched up by the same rhetoric as being used on stage.
Yes.
And that, I think, is an important point. The rhetoric is in an age which took in so much of its information by the ear and was accustomed to doing so. It's very, very difficult to ignore the fact that they will be watching people making a grand rhetorical speech in a quite different way to the way we do, because they will know what the code is. They will know what sort of rhetoric they're getting. They're experienced listeners. They listen to sermons an awful lot, which is another theatrical performance.
Yes.
And they can see when somebody is arguing a causa honesta, an honest case, or a lying case, a disgraceful case. You can see that beautifully in so many places. And one thinks of how in Julius Caesar, those two funeral speeches are textbook examples of the different sorts of rhetoric.
Yes.
One which appeals to the reason, and one which is the rhetoric of the open hand, literally called the rhetoric of the open hand, the Asiatic, which is seeking emotional engagement. And you watch that crowd on stage being manipulated, but you are being manipulated yourself at the same time, and you know it. That's the key thing. And remember that the word audience does mean people who are listening.
Yes.
Hearing this. They go to hear a play. That's what they used to say. So it's a wonderful world. And of course, the world receives a massive, massive boost. The opening up of lots of other possibilities with the company acquiring the Blackfriars. An enclosed theatre, one that could be played in all weathers, nearer the court. And there's a palpable change in the sort of plays that Jonson and Shakespeare wrote after they could play at the Blackfriars. They're definitely more upmarket. They use music a lot more. How can you seriously use music in an open space like the Globe or the Rose? But you can in the Blackfriars. And it will appeal to a different sort of audience. We know, for example, that people could stand in the yard at the theatres on the South Bank for a penny. The audience at the Blackfriars was seated. Now, that makes a huge difference, because when you're standing in a yard, you will move around because you can't stand still.
Yes.
Nobody can stand still. You've got to keep changing your position. But if you're seated, you can. The cheapest seats were 2 shillings. That's a lot of money.
Yes.
So it's a very much more restricted audience.
Yeah.
And that's lots and lots of different resources. And we could have a whole new talk on how that affects the construction of, say, The Tempest or The Alchemist or The Winter's Tale. Now, the final point that I want to look at is the instability of the text. We have a concept of textual integrity, authorial, true readings.
Yes.
That was invented in human scholarship for ancient authors from about the 14th century onward. It was only very slowly applied to vernacular authors, let alone playwrights, who had a very, very low status for most of Shakespeare's working life. I mean, for example, when Ben Jonson published his collected works in 1616, several of his friends were shocked that he bothered to include his plays. Oh, Ben, for heaven's sake, you don't include plays. But, the idea of a text, the or text, doesn't really wash. You can see them trying to apply it in the preface to the first folio of 1623, when Hemmings and Cundall say that the texts they have got are according to his true copies. But we know that Middleton added bits to Macbeth.
Right.
We know that we can see Hamlet adding bits to the play, the Murder of Gonzago in Hamlet. There are authorial revisions. The quarto text of King Lear, for example, and the folio text are quite different. Something is happening in Othello along the same lines. Look at the earlier plays. Peele almost certainly wrote the first act of Titus Andronicus, probably wrote the first half of the second part of Henry VI. But we think of them as being, these are Shakespeare's plays. No, they're Shakespeare and lots of other people as well. And they're edited according to each performance. Henry V, as we have the play, could never have been played. It wouldn't work because there's just too much there. And it's almost certain that most people think that there was an earlier version of Henry V with a part for Falstaff. That's what's promised at the end of Henry IV.
Exactly, yeah.
But Will Kemp leaves the company in 1599. Everybody heaves a sigh of relief. But here's the man who played Falstaff.
So he gets written out.
So, right, we have another version of Henry V, but then Henry V has one of the choruses says awfully nice things about Essex, who has just been disgraced. Oh dear, we can't put that on. Remember the Essex failed rebellion in Ireland.
Yeah.
So what do? Well, we better get rid of that and have another version, the quarto version. And if you look at the quarto version of Henry V, it's very much shorter. It's got 16 fewer speaking parts, and it gets rid of most of the choruses. It gets rid of the night before Agincourt. Wow. It gets rid of once more onto the breach, dear friends. And you're left with a very much more gung-ho Henry. And you're left with a play which is basically let's go and bash the frogs.
Right.
And all the grey areas and the shadows in Henry V, which I might say I think is a very fine play.
Absolutely.
And very, very critical of historical myth. All that have gone. And it's something, the Privy Council or the Master of the Revels, I'll sign this one off. This is no problem at all. But we've got no evidence of the play we know as Henry V ever having been played, which is really interesting, I think.
Yeah.
So what does all this suggest? That we should perhaps think more carefully about the idea of the author. What is an author? What the first conclusion would be, I think, that authors are among the many makers of a Renaissance play. But there are changes coming around 1600. We've already mentioned one. Our title pages begin to record the author, which suggests that the author is becoming somebody you notice and might even be a selling point. The printing of a play text. Now that's fascinating, because what were people reading when they read a play? This is a type of reading that they had never had before. Now, why did they buy it? Are they buying it because this is a record of something they've watched and they want to have it as an aide-memoire? In which case, are they reading the words on the page, or are those words on the page stimulating a memory, which is a different sort of thing altogether?
Yes.
Furthermore, reading, that's an individual experience. It's not a communal one. And clearly there was a commercial possibility here, but it's developing a whole new way of reading and reading about narrative, because plays are very different sorts of narrative to a novel. The beginning are the beginnings of a novel. And of course, there is the rise in status that goes with the authority of a printed text. So it's a push me, pull you, all right, let's print it so we make a bit more money. Well, that reflexively gives the author a bit more of a central position. How did people read? Well, one model they would have had for reading was the reading of romances, an early type of novel, which those tools could be applied to the very sparse narrative of the reading of a play. And this would lead to, again, reflexively, new expectations of what a play should do. And because you've got time when you're reading alone to reflect, as you would in a romance, on what the characters are thinking and saying, but may not be down on the page, that's going to change the idea of character. And this may be where we begin to see, was it Harold Bloom, Shakespeare and the Rise of the Individual? Yeah, where plays can actually change the way we think about ourselves. I'm very attracted by that idea. I mean, if you look at sort of earlier fiction, like Chaucer's great poem, Troilus and Cresside, you know remarkably little about those characters. You know an awful lot about what they are thinking and saying in certain situations, but you've no idea what they look like. You've no idea what Troilus like for breakfast. They're not rounded characters, because you don't need to know that. You just know that he's a knight, and a knight that role has certain characteristics and duties. You know that Cresside is a lady, and a lady who is beloved, and that brings with it certain expectations of that character. So I think that we have to move from a position where you've got a self operating in non-organic roles, say, a Richard III, who is the consummate actor, how many Richard IIIs are there in that play? Everyone we see is different, with a different rhetoric. Move from that to the sort of self we get in Macbeth, or I think starts really particularly with Henry V and Hamlet the same year. Why? Possibly a fruit of the Protestant insistence on introspection and self-examination. There's another lecture there. But it's also clearly changed in the idea of acting, where the word personating begins to be used, where instead of performing a role, there is a suggestion you're actually presenting a person. Now that's a really big issue.
Yeah.
So I think I've probably got to draw it to a close there. But it is, I think, part of Shakespeare's genius that he can take a sort of stock sort of character, like the Machiavel, the standard stage villain, the outsider, the disturber, the clown, and just think how often he does that, and then plays it against the grain. If you looked at the second scene of Hamlet, you've got a big court scene, and it's an image of good order. You have a king who's doing what a king should be doing. He's making peace. Blessed are the peacemakers. And visually, you've got one person who doesn't fit. You've got a man in black standing near the edge of the stage who has no place in this hierarchy. Ah, there's the villain, the Machiavel. But no, it's Hamlet. Look at how Hamlet actually has more deaths to his credit than anybody else in the play.
Yes.
He plays the role of, he is the Machiavel, he is the villain, but he's not, he's the hero. Exactly the same with Othello, who does exactly what the black villain is supposed to do, but in fact he's the hero. And golly, what a change that makes. I took my granddaughter, aged about 8 or 9, to see Richard III. And her reaction was very interesting. She had no experience of any theatre before that. Now, it was quite clear that Richard III was the villain. But she said at the end of the play, she said, I felt awfully sorry for Richard. And I thought, yeah, you've got it, Neil. Yeah. You can take somebody and you can turn the expectations upside down if you're a genius like Shakespeare. Take Edmund in King Lear. In the first scene, exactly like Aaron in Titus Andronicus, he's silent, he's watchful. Anything he says, well, Aaron doesn't say anything, but anything that Edmund says is guarded, dutiful. And, you know, he's got that dreadful father who talks to Kent as if Edmund was not there. You know, he was abroad and will away again. You know, just think what it might be like to be Edmund. And you suddenly think, hang on, there might be something going on here, which is not that simple. And his career is utterly destructive. No wonder he's got no time for his father. But when the bodies of Goneril and Regan, both of whom desired him, are brought in, he quite unexpectedly says, yet Edmund was beloved. The other poisoned for my sake, and after slew herself. Suddenly you think, oh my God, fathers, think of Andrew Agueji, the clown par excellence. And Toby Bell says, the wench adores me. I was adored once too. And it's funny, but it's utterly, utterly moving.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nobody else does this. It's quite astonishing. So much more to say, and much more to say about the afterlife of Shakespeare. And when I use that word Shakespeare, am I talking about Shakespeare or Shakespeare?
Well, plenty to think about there. My thanks to Charles for his time and for sharing such fascinating details with us. To see more about Charles, his publications and other writings, including a fuller biography, you can go to www.charlesmoseley.com. And I've put a link to that in the show notes and on the episode details at the podcast website. If you haven't done so already, please join the Facebook page or group or find the podcast on Instagram, Blue Sky or X to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can also contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.